everything we do, whether it's prevention, education, treatment, it's about the substance. It's about the substance. It's about the substance. It has nothing to do with the substance, right?
Yeah.
But it's our attitudes towards these substances, and because you're using this substance or you use that substance, that makes you this kind of human being that we don't value or don't like or criminalize, right? And that's, for lack of a better, term, it's bullshit.
Welcome to Health Professionals in Recovery, a podcast for healthcare practitioners interested in substance use disorder, harm reduction, and recovery from addiction. Our hope is to provide education and support for those struggling in silence, recovering, and those who care for patients who suffer with substance use disorder. For more resources, please visit our website at www.healthprosinrecovery.com or follow us on Twitter at HPIR Podcast. And now, the hosts of Health Professionals in Recovery, Sean Fogler and Bill Kinkle.
Welcome to Health Professionals in Recovery. I'm Sean Fogler.
And I'm Bill Kinkle.
And today we're going to have a bit of an off-the-cuff discussion on relapse and recognizing it, and discuss a little bit about Bill's experience recently.
Yeah, we figured that, you go to treatment, and one of the most painful groups that you have to sit through repeatedly over and over again is relapse prevention. And I always found most of the things that they spoke about, I just thought it was really abstract, and it wasn't realistic. I mean, they would talk a lot about triggers, and you would hear things like people, places, and things. And it's really hard in life to avoid all those things. And a lot of times they would talk about like these little strategies that you could implement, right, when you're having a craving or an obsessive thought. And they never seemed to work for me. I mean, like, one suggestion was keep a Band-Aid around your wrist, and when you're having those thoughts, snap the Band-Aid to interrupt the thought. And I remember many times driving down to buy drugs, snapping like crazy, hoping it would work. And I just never found a lot of those strategies to be very helpful for me.
Yeah, I remember being in treatment and them drawing this picture of trigger, thought, craving, use, and talking about strategies to interrupt it. And I don't know, I think sometimes, in fact, most of the time, you don't really have the insight, and it's a slow, kind of progressive thing that happens, right? They always talk about how a relapse happens long before the use actually happens, frequently many months before. And so and when it's slow like that, it's very hard to recognize, and what's going on with yourself. And I think it highlights the importance of having strong connections and listening to the people around you. At least I've found personally.
Yeah, and I have too. And I think that's sort of why I thought it'd be fun to talk about this, because in my own life, very recently, I'm actually on the downside right now of fighting off a relapse, and everything that happened, I didn't really see it coming from a traditional standpoint of, what we would think about leading up to a relapse. The thoughts that I had I didn't really notice them. Other people around me did, but like you just said, it was such a slow, progressive thing, and it was influenced by so many other factors that I think what fuels, or kind of what the anatomy of a relapse is a lot more complex than we've ever really talked about or thought about before. And so I think it'd be fun to just kind of break down my experience over the past month and a half or so, and just really how things built up. And it could have been catastrophic for me had certain things not been into place, and had I not been able to learn from past experiences where I relapsed. And for me, looking back and really analyzing critically what happened at those times that I started to use again after long periods of sobriety, what led to that. And I think I've done a lot of work trying to figure that out, but all the plans that I put into place based on what I've learned before about myself, I never had to deploy that before until recently to see how would it work. Would I be able to prevent using again if things, if the pressures and the stress built up to the level of a breaking point for me. And so I think that's sort of why we were going to talk today.
Yeah, I also think like that highlights another big point is that, having some time like in sobriety can be very valuable because it takes time to gain that insight and to gather the tools needed when something like this creeps up on you, because it really is, I'm trying to think of the word. It really, I can't think of the word, but it's so subtle. It's,
Yeah.
even if you do recognize it, you probably don't recognize how critical it is. Even like small behaviors, or, I know for me, like how I react with my kids, if I get frustrated more easily, or angry more easily. And that goes with any relationship around me, but it's like you need people to point it out, and you also need to listen, right? And a lot of times it's like really hard. You don't want to listen.
Yeah.
You're not interested in what anybody says, but frequently, having those eyes on you gives you better insight into yourself, especially early on in recovery, because it takes time. And I always say, like, I mean, part of recovery is like creating space, and the space gets larger in terms of like you're dealing with something in the world, and initially you just have a reflexive action. But over time, you think about that for a few seconds, and maybe that few seconds turns into, 20 seconds, and turns into a minute, and turns into 5 minutes. And finally, something happens around you, and you think about, oh, well, this is how I'm feeling, and this is how I want to react, but I know that that's not going to be healthy. And, it's like creating space, right? And I hate like counting time, and I don't, I think it's problematic to say, oh, I have X amount of days. But I do think it does take time to really develop these skills and these strategies, and the willingness to listen, because I think most of the time I am, but frequently when I'm like at my worst, I don't want to listen to anybody, right? I'm very hard-headed. Though I always thought I was easygoing, but I guess that's not exactly the case.
You're a lot more easygoing than I am, that's for
Yeah,
sure.
maybe.
You're
I don't
Canadian,
know.
so
Yeah, no, true. But it's a process, and it is not easy at all. And I know, Bill, you're going to talk a bit about like, your work experience, because work can be one of the most triggering and challenging, places to be, in dealing with things like that.
yeah, and what I think a lot of what we do in our like relapse prevention, at least the official relapse prevention, it's so superficial and so impractical and so generalized that for me it just was really impractical in use. So, for instance, the environment that I worked in, this job that I had, I guess I have to explain a little bit of what the job was and how it worked, and the role that I was in. But this role violates some of the core principles of relapse prevention. So I was in a role, where I worked with active drug users, and part of my role was sitting with them every day as they were actively using, in a harm reduction, supportive role, trying to help them with they were people that were freshly housed after being homeless for a long period of time. And the particular folks that I worked with were injection drug users. And so a lot of it was harm reduction, a lot of it was just really helping them to use safer, a lot of overdose prevention and safer injection practices to keep them safe, more, from a public health standpoint. And so for someone who's in recovery as an injection drug user, an injection opioid user, if I was in treatment and said that's the job I wanted to go into, I would be highly discouraged from that, because that would be seen as you're going right back into the most triggering environment. And yet when I was in that role, the sense that I had and the feeling of satisfaction for me personally, that job for me felt like what I was born to do. I went to work and I loved everything that I got to do. I loved spending time with the people I got to spend time with. I loved just learning about, like, just teaching them better ways to inject, cleaner practices, ways to keep them from getting infections, being there if they overdosed and being able to reverse it. Because what I found is these conversations would just develop from that safe space and a non-judgmental space. The people really started to talk honestly about what they wanted out of life. And the way that I've defined my own the way that I've defined my own recovery and that I think about recovery has a lot to do with, am I happy in my life, and do I have purpose in my life? I think those are the things that we should look at for recovery. What is it that we can help a person do so that they feel satisfied and have purpose in their life? And when I was with people, even in the midst of them actively using, those were most often where the conversations went, of this really isn't what I want to do, but I'm not even sure what I want to do. And so for me, it was so incredibly satisfying to be in that job. But back to the relapse prevention, that should have triggered me, right? Like, I should have been sitting across from someone who is fixing and injecting a bag of dope. That should have been a trigger for me, but it wasn't. I never had one urge to use through that. And I think that's because the underlying thing that was going on in my life is that I was so happy and content, because I felt that was the purpose of my life, is to help people through this event. But then what happened was, so I was in a role with this organization that I worked in, and it's kind of split. The people that they house after being homeless, there's several teams of people that work primarily with folks who are suffering with pretty high-level mental illness, and then there's other teams that work with injection drug users. And I floated between teams, but I had been on the injection drug user team for about 4 or 5 months. So I developed some really intense personal relationships with people on that team and really worked closely with them. But then, because of needs in the organization, I was transferred to one of the mental health teams where I have no background in that. I felt really uncomfortable, and I just felt really unsatisfied. I mean, part of it was because of the separation from people that I cared about personally as human beings, but I felt like that was my purpose in life, was to do that job. And now being taken over to another area where I felt very unsatisfied and unequipped and just really unqualified to be doing that job, I started to notice that my mental health started to disintegrate pretty quickly. I became depressed and really, just unsatisfied with the job. And so over time, my wife is the one who started to pick up on things, like you talked about earlier, that, I was a little bit, more impatient than usual with the kids. I was waking up all hours of the night with a lot of anxiety and just was really off, and she was noticing that my mental health was disintegrating. And I noticed a little bit, but not to the degree that I should have. It wasn't until much later that I started realizing that that I was actively starting to think about using drugs again. But it wasn't in the typical way that we think about cravings. I didn't have a crave to use, but what I found is that I was depressed. I became very sad, and I just wanted that sadness. What I would often think about is like, boy, I would like to just use something to take the edge off. So when I go home at night, I'm not feeling so miserable, that I could, even synthetically, because drugs are really good at that, particularly opioids. You pop a Percocet, you're going to feel pretty good. You're going to be synthetically happy. And I got to the point that I was almost willing to exchange the consequences and the risk of developing an opioid use disorder all over again and start to exhibit signs of an opioid use disorder, because I was so unhappy all the time and I just wanted to feel better. But it was interesting that I couldn't really talk to Trish, my wife, about it, because I had to go to work every day in an area where drugs are readily available, and I didn't want her to be concerned. So I did talk to you, like incrementally, like even talking to you. Like, do you remember that? Like,
yeah. No, I do. I mean, you just brought up so many important points. I mean, the first is drugs serve a purpose, right? And people use drugs for good reasons most of the time, and frequently it's to manage emotional or physical pain. And when you strip that away from somebody, there better be some other strategy to address that, right? And frequently we want to say, don't do anything, and the fact that your abstinence means you're healthy. Not exactly. It doesn't work that way. The other thing is meaning and purpose. Like having yes, we want less overdose deaths and we don't want people to die. But I always say that's such a narrow measure of success. Like it's not, recovery isn't about survival. It's about thriving, and having meaning and purpose is one of the most crucial things to a healthy recovery. It's necessary. Maybe one of the most important things, and we were talking earlier about, Viktor Frankl's book, Man's Search for Meaning, where he spent time in a concentration camp. And, there's that famous line, he who has a why can bear any how. And it's a mindset thing. If you don't have a purpose and a meaning in life, how are you supposed to survive? How are you supposed to, do all the things that are necessary in recovery? And, whether you're at a treatment center or you're in drug court, there is no way. And that's why the success rates are abysmal. They're awful, because it's much, much more. And we're not addressing that. We're like, okay, let's give out more naloxone. Let's give out more MAT. And that's good stuff. That needs to happen, and that helps. But it's not enough. It's not even close to enough. It's a much bigger issue, and we need to focus on that meaning and purpose, because everybody needs that to live, a healthy, connected life. And it's their life, it's their life. And for us to tell them they need to do this to be valued, and to deserve life is ridiculous, right? And if we're talking about harm reduction, that is not a harm reduction attitude, right? Like, many organizations claiming that they're all about harm reduction, but it's harm reduction if you do A, B, C, D, E, F, G, and this too. And if you don't, you're out. And that's not how it works, right? That's just not how it works.
No, not at all. I just think I just think for years we've been focused on the wrong thing. Like when we talk about the drug, like everything seems to be so focused on the drug, and what can you do to avoid using the drug? And like once again for me, one, I didn't see it coming, that it just came in such a weird way that I just didn't realize what was happening, that I was starting to feel more and more lousy. But a lot of it was sitting with people, and it's like you just said, we do all these different things, but unless you give someone meaning in their life and purpose, it doesn't really make a difference. And so I was working in this area where we housed people, and I really quickly started to realize that, housing's a human right. Everyone should be housed. But it became so apparent that it's not enough. Like now these people are isolated in these homes, and the conversations revolved heavily around, I just want to find out what I'm supposed to do, and I want to have something that is of value to humanity. And so it was fascinating that I was working with people who suffered with the same thing and then all of a sudden I'm in this place of what I do every day I don't feel has value, or at least it has value, but I didn't have the sense of this is what I should be doing with my life. Like it was amazing to me how such a tiny shift in what I did at work and the population that I worked with had such massive effects on me, my mental health, how it impacted my family, how it impacted my productivity in my personal life and advocacy life, my friendship with you. All these things changed because of such a subtle thing. And so I learned a lot from that. Because I've analyzed a ton, because in my own personal life I had this fall into deep addiction at 34, 3.5 years of pretty severe addiction, 5 years of recovery, then a relapse for a couple years. And so I've spent a lot of time looking at what happened in between that 5-year period of recovery and when I picked up using again. And that's sort of how Trish and I kind of developed the safety quote unquote relapse prevention plan for myself was, okay, clearly it was, I didn't feel connected at work back then. So I was part of this. I worked for a church, but I didn't feel like I was really part of it. I didn't feel like I was part of the team. And I didn't feel like I was accepted as a member of the team. I didn't really like the work that I was doing. I didn't really feel like it served. I didn't feel like that's what I should be doing with my life. And that led to heavy depression, which took a long time to slowly build before I picked up, to the point that I don't even remember the day that I picked up using drugs again. It just sort of happened. But from that is where we sort of developed this idea of like, okay, depression clearly was a trigger for me at these 2 points. But this past period, last week, was Trish and I were talking about it, and I realized I don't really have the capacity to look at myself objectively enough to know that these things are happening. But she did. And I think this also brings up the benefit of, having a spouse. Like being a person in recovery who has a spouse who's very well aware of what's going on. And the only reason that she was so aware is because of the level of my transparency with her in the past, of trying to realize these are the things that lead to me not feeling satisfied in my life. And for me, for whatever reason, it matters. I'm not some guy that's going to do well with a Monday 9 to 5. I envy the people that can do that for 40 years and then retire. I can't. My life has to have some kind of purpose in the work that I do. I want it to have some type of lasting impression on humanity to make it better. And if I'm not doing that, then I don't do well personally. And so it was fascinating to me. Just this whole thing has been fascinating to me, looking at that. We created this recovery plan that actually worked. Mm-hmm. It didn't work the way that I intended it to.
And that's why this stuff can't be cookie cutter, right? Because there's usually a pattern. Like I know, no matter what happens, if my thinking shifts and I start thinking a certain way and acting a certain way, that I'm headed down that road. But I really need somebody on the outside. And every recovery or relapse prevention plan is unique. I mean, it's just like recovery. No cookie cutter, I go to 4 meetings a week. I go to my therapist once a week. I read, morning meditations. Like, that's all good stuff. But like just prescribing that as like, that's the prescription for everybody who struggles with substances or process addictions is ridiculous. It doesn't work, and even in recovery, it changes over time. What worked for me on day one doesn't necessarily work for me now, and what worked for me, a year ago, it's different, right? Like, and sometimes exercise is part of that, or yoga, or meditation, or hanging out with my friends, or, there's so many different ways to recover and strategies. And just like with a relapse plan, the same stuff is not necessarily going to work, right? Like what worked today, didn't necessarily work yesterday, or won't necessarily work tomorrow. So like this stuff's all fluid. I mean, we want to put it into some kind of algorithm and plug everybody into it, but like it doesn't work. And the other thing that I find really interesting is, as a healthcare professional, it's not like you can call up your monitoring organization, which is a monitoring organization that says they're about health and wellness, and pick up the phone and say, hey, I'm struggling. I feel like I'm going to use drugs again, because the repercussions of that, like the consequences, it could be catastrophic. You may be signing another agreement. You may go for another assessment. You may end up in rehab for another 90 days. Maybe you need it. Maybe you don't. I don't know. Are they expert? Are they the experts? They claim to be the experts. Some are very good. Some places are straight up dangerous. So it goes back to the whole culture of silence. Shut up, grate your teeth, do your best. But that doesn't work very well. And frequently people die because of that, right? And we should be able to call up, our monitoring agency or our health professionals, organization that's supposed to be about health and wellness for healthcare providers, and speak openly, or send a letter and actually get a response. This is how I'm feeling. I'm uncomfortable with this, and frequently you just, keep doing more, come on in. We'll, have you talk to the psychiatrist again. That's not always helpful. Frequently it's not. And frequently it's dangerous,
Yeah.
on the other side. And so, like, it's really tricky. The fact that we're even here speaking about this openly like this, can be problematic, when it actually, goes live and somebody listens to it, from the monitoring board. It's and we shouldn't feel that way. We
Right.
should be allowed to speak about, our mental health or, issues openly and honestly without fear of retribution. And this goes back to, Leah Beletsky and Sarah Wakeman's article about, healthcare provider exceptionalism, and you can't have MAT if you're a healthcare provider. It's ridiculous and absurd, and like that's just one small, not small. I mean, it's a big thing, but it's just an example of this same kind of attitude, right? That's pervasive within the medical community, and it's ridiculous and it's harmful.
Yeah, I totally agree. I mean, I hadn't even considered that aspect of this, of, this going live and the monitoring program imposing, more requirements on me. Because I don't know if we want to go down this this path of discussion.
May as well.
But
It doesn't have to be. We don't need to put it out there.
right, but no, but I mean, just so over the past 2 years, everything that I've done with them, none of the requirements of that program would have given me any tools to deal with this. One, nothing that I have done, requirements of the Board of Nursing, would have given me the insight to see this coming and to develop the plan that I did. All that was work that I did on my own, on the side, through spending a considerable amount of time going through all the emotions, going through past journals, past emails, looking at the way that I was writing back then over different periods of time, and looking at patterns of thought and looking at the subtleties, and clearly I was thinking different by the way that I was writing emails and different things. And by analyzing that stuff about and learning more about myself through all this introspective work is how I developed this plan. And this goes back to why we talk all the time about tailored recovery plans, why every person's recovery needs to be tailored specifically for them. And if we're really about quote unquote success rates, whatever success means, but if we're really about giving someone the best life they can possibly have in recovery, to them to find personal wellness and a personal sense of satisfaction and purpose in their life, we've got to look at them as individuals and not cookie cut anything. And that's what happened here. The only reason that right now I'm either not in my bathroom shooting a bag of heroin or dead somewhere because I overdosed, the only reason that happened is because of the work that my wife and I and my friends, that we've all done to really understand myself better. And so what would have been most helpful for the past 2 years, instead of spending 3 to 4 hours a week going to 12-step meetings, is if I would have had the opportunity to work with a therapist who could have, from a professional standpoint, because all the work that I've done has been unprofessional. It's been myself trying to look at myself as objectively as possible, that's impossible at times. But it would have been so much more useful to have a professional work with me over all these things that I pulled out about myself, because I'm sure there's blind spots. Maybe I could have seen this sooner. Maybe it didn't need to get to this point, because ultimately the decision that I made to protect my recovery is I quit my job, because I wasn't going to be moved back to the team that I felt like I had the most impact on, the team that gave me purpose. I was going to be kept on these other teams pretty much indefinitely, and that destroyed me. And so through a lot of pain, Tricia and I had to decide that the best thing for me to do 2 weeks before Christmas was to quit my job and to find a new job, because the safety of our family and the safety of my recovery is paramount in our lives. And I think a lot of times that's something else that we don't talk about, is that the decisions that we have to make to protect our recovery are not as simple as we want to make them sound. Quitting my job 2 weeks before Christmas, being the father of 3, 4, and 5-year-old age children, is not an easy decision to make. And so we shouldn't make it seem like it's just such an easy thing to do, because these are the complex things. This is the muddy water that we live in as people in recovery, right? These are the decisions that we have to make that are just so not as simple as they sound in treatment.
And should you really have to make that choice, right? The safety and security of employment and providing for your family or your recovery, right? And the fact is you were moved from an area of work where you had meaning and purpose and were excited about to an area you weren't. And even though you verbalized that, you weren't given that option. So it was like, do I survive and protect my recovery, or do I continue here for the safety and security, of this job, which is, and like those choices, you shouldn't have to make those choices. Those choices are, they're just, they're ridiculous. And I mean, it comes back to the whole, that everybody's like, everybody always says, whatever you put in front of your recovery, you're going to lose. And I mean, you prioritize your recovery, which is great, but you should be able to provide for your family. You should be able to do something that gives you meaning and purpose. And you should, I mean, you're in a healthcare professional program too, and you should be able to lean on them as well. And the fact is, if the healthcare, professional program is really interested in health and wellness of providers, they should be investing in this. They should be funding, therapists and groups. And as we know, being in these programs, you have to pay for your own treatment, right? And I think these programs do a better job if you still have your license and you're still practicing, right? Clearly, that's better because you have your meaning and purpose and your career is intact. And, even if, it's been of a bumpy ride, but you're working in your, chosen field, the thing that you've been working towards for years and years. And so, and financially you're doing, quite well, and it's much easier to afford that stuff. But for somebody like sitting on the sidelines, waiting to get their license back or fighting to get their license back, it is, an almost insurmountable hurdle. Not that it doesn't happen, not that it can't be done, but it's just far more challenging. And the system's not designed for that because, it's not, it's about, I mean, like we say all the time, it's about the illusion of protecting the public and the health and wellness, because that's not what they're really doing, right? And we all know that.
Right.
It's really the, it's.
But we could, Sean. Like the thing
we
is,
could.
We like. I've said this a million times too. Like we have a great foundation in PHPs and other professional monitoring programs. We have a great sort of structure to work around and make some changes to. And and if we would add some flexibility, going back to the tailored recovery plans, if we had a lot of flexibility with individuals, just think about how much better it would be for patients out there.
It could be infinitely better. The problem is these programs, they are not willing to speak openly and provide data about what they're doing, how they're doing, what their real success rates are, what their challenges are. They are operating in a vacuum with no oversight. Most medical boards take their word as, the word of God, without it, and so we have no idea. Maybe they are doing a great job. They claim to be doing a great job, but we know that's not necessarily true, and there's a lot of selection bias and other issues. But the fact is we don't know. And if they really wanted to be better, they would open the door. There would be transparency, right? Because if you want to be better, you're transparent, and you like, come in, tell us how we can do this better. We're having challenges with, this group, is giving us challenges. Can we do this? Like, they should be sharing information. And every state professional monitoring program, they're different. They have different requirements. Some have PEth testing, some don't. Some do X amount of urines a week, some do less, some do more. Some require you to go to groups, some don't. It's ridiculous. There's no standardization. Nobody's talking about it. You have, a centralized, more federal, group of health monitoring programs. that exists. I'm not sure exactly what they do. They talk about best practices. I don't really know where those are from. Like we know, X amount of 12-step meetings a week is apparently the magic number. 4, like, is 3 too little? Is 5 too many? Like, I mean, it's just there's so many arbitrary things, and it's and I know, like, historically it was to do good, right? And I think historically, way back in the day, it was a lot more about health and wellness. Now it's about protecting the board and protecting the PHP and protecting hospitals, because if something goes wrong, they can say, oh, look, his urines, he didn't have any positive urines for X amount of years. He went to X amount of groups, he did what he was supposed to do, so he's safe. But there's so much,
But this also, I mean, I think what I just went through, what we just talked about, I think also factors into that. Okay, so you've got whatever the number is, 3 years, 5 years in this monitoring program. You have 3 years of negative drug screens. You've got 3 years or 5 years of 12-step attendance 3 times a week, 4 times a week, right? You're unleashed from this thing. You're declared, okay, you're safe to go. And then you go on to do whatever. But that doesn't account. Like, I could have been through this program. I could have been practicing. If I wasn't aware of my life circumstances, if I wasn't aware of how that would impact my mental health, and how that may cause a resurgence of symptoms for me, mental health symptoms that I would seek, because this wasn't about an exacerbation of my opioid use disorder history. As far as I'm concerned, I don't have symptoms. I don't fit the diagnostic criteria to have an opioid use disorder anymore. I am recovered from an opioid use disorder. But this stuff brought up symptoms that were mental health symptoms, were symptoms much more of depression. The way that I have historically treated depression for myself, because I'm not usually aware that I'm depressed, has been through the use of opioids and other medications to help manage the symptoms of depression. And I think that's a really clear distinction. The reason that finding drugs popped into my head again was because I've learned over repeated past sessions of drug use that they're really good about fixing when I feel this way. You know what I mean? And so it doesn't mean that I would have. Yeah, it doesn't mean that I would have gone down that whole path again.
Yeah,
but
they work.
They work. I guess my overall point about this was that you could have someone who does well in these programs for 5 years, and then 5 years later, something could change in their life that they're going to use drugs again. And these programs have done nothing at all to help them identify that and create some type of plan to intervene, because you're so busy jumping through hoops to get your license back that I am no better, that you potentially could be, you could actually be worse off, quote unquote, successfully completing or graduating from one of these programs, because you've done nothing to work on the true underlying reason why you may have used a substance in the first place.
And 5 years is supposed to be the magic number. 5 years, your chances of, a recurrence of use are supposed to go down.
Well, I ruined that
dramatically. Well, yeah, I mean, you just said you had been, abstinent or in recovery for 5 years. Like, it's a lifelong process. But the other thing, that how you were saying you feel like you're recovered, and I mean, that begs the question, is it a disease, right? Or is it a learning disorder? And like, we've talked about that. Sure. And I think it depends on the person and individual. That's the thing about this, is there's no absolutes. Right. There are just no absolutes. Everybody's different. And
however, the entire PHP system is designed around the idea that I have a chronic relapsing brain disorder. And so that does factor into policy. That factors into all the requirements that I have to do, because that's the understanding. Yeah. I don't personally subscribe to that or believe that.
And, and a chronic relapsing brain disorder that we treat for 5 years and then we stop treating.
Right. So
right, and then you're fine. Right. You're so good. We're going to certify you to to do whatever you want to do.
Yeah, like, I mean, the brain disease model would actually dictate that these programs should monitor me for life. Right. As if drug screens and 12-step meetings are going to give you any type of objective information about how I'm doing.
Zero.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's asinine. That's,
So it's, I mean, but like you said earlier, it is a good foundation, and we do need some kind of system, but it can be dramatically improved. But that starts with speaking openly and honestly about what is going on, right? Who's running these programs? What are they doing? What, I mean, we have no idea, and we know, looking at some other states' data, that a lot of the relationships with treatment centers and providers are, questionable at best. There's a lot of relationships that may not be totally above board, and so it's a system that needs to be overhauled and improved, and and there's many different issues, but in terms of relapsing or recurrence of use, like it is about having insight, and it's about being I mean, the one thing that I found really helpful with my health program was the work in groups and working with other professionals that were struggling with these things, because I mean, there are some unique things that we go through, and challenges, and even being exposed, like in your job, you were exposed to people doing illicit drugs, but in the hospital you were exposed to illicit drugs, right? And how you manage that, and those can be interesting challenges and unique things. And then the stress that we talk about, and compassion fatigue, and vicarious trauma, and all, a whole host of things that are unique to providers that are like doing this work day in and day out. And these programs, at least my program, I was connected with a good group of people, and some of the health professional meetings can be very helpful, but those you're really doing independently, like it's
yeah, but that's only if you find that stuff helpful.
Yeah,
I mean,
yeah,
so
and that was for me. I'm
yeah.
talking about myself.
Yeah.
Some people go in and they're like, "This is useless. It
Well,
does
maybe
nothing
because-
for me. It makes me more anxious." And so they should have a different plan, right? And so, like for me, the standard cookie cutter plan worked, I guess. I mean, I was already a year and a half into recovery before I even joined the program.
Sure.
So I was pretty stable. So, I did what they told me, and most of it was helpful. Some of it was useless. But I did it, because it's what I had to do. But I know many people now, and I knew many people that didn't find it helpful at all, and then some of the strategies were downright, I'm not even sure how they were legal, like, mandated naltrexone injections and stuff like this, that nobody has any business dictating that kind of thing. But it's just, it varies on the person. Yeah. It just comes back to the same thing we were saying. It's got to be, tailor-made. Like, it's everybody, finds value in the way they find value. Right. And the worst case scenario is that it's dangerous, that it pushes people out the door, and you hear stories all the time of somebody who committed suicide, or somebody who is now using again, or, something awful happened, and that's just not, it doesn't need to be that way.
Yeah, of course not. I just mean in terms of like those support groups and meetings, I find them very similar to like social media. So for me, if I would put on Twitter, hey, I'm actually struggling with an urge to use, and put that out there, I'm sure the advice that I would have gotten would be very standard things that you would hear people, you know what I mean, to do, because that's what we've been told over and over again, that I don't find helpful. What I really need is someone who really understands me, and who actually listens to me and believes me when I say, I understand myself really well. These are the things that have not worked. These are the things that I'm trying to work through. Help me work through these things here. And that's really rare to find. And I think this is also where a highly trained peer specialist would work, because you're working intimately with a person for a long time. And I feel like I said, going into a support group and throwing this out there, you're going to get a lot of advice from people who don't know you and don't know the subtleties and the complexities of your personality. Like, I could talk to you about issues. I could talk to Trish about issues that I'm going through because you're my friend. She's my spouse. You guys understand me well, but you also listen to me when I give you information about myself that I know about myself to help me interpret.
You're the expert on you.
Right, but nobody treats that
no,
way, right?
And peers, I mean, peer support, I think, is one of the most powerful and critical aspects to any of this. I mean, honestly, like, I would, like, meetings are hit or miss. You know, I like an occasional meeting, but I think that's more important. You know, meeting with a peer, speaking with a peer on the phone, whatever it is like that. Somebody who gets to know you, understands you, values you, because the systems themselves, in general, are not really valuing you. Like, they are just systems, right? To design to do something that's not unique to you, right? It's just lining the dominoes up for whoever's, invested in that system, whether it's, the medical board or nursing board or whoever it is. And so peers, peers, I think, are vital. Peers have helped me immensely. I provide peer support to other people. I think it's the magic. I think it's like the future to recovery. Far more important than, some of these treatment organizations. Far more important than going to 12-step meetings and not. Some people love 12-step meetings. It's great. I find them helpful sometimes, but having a prescribed number of 12
Don't make me go, though.
No, I know, no.
That's the difference.
Well, I know you, and I know that's and that's not for you. So, like, I mean, you working with a peer, involved in some of your hobbies and connected to other people in other ways. That's recovery too.
Well,
right?
and I say that. Well, and I say the don't make me go, and I know that it sounds like I may be really hard on 12 steps, but that's not my point. So my point is, a support group is predicated on the idea that it's voluntary. And so for the benefit of everyone else who AA works tremendously for, don't force people to go who don't find it helpful. Because I have to work really hard. Like, I generally stay very quiet in the meetings because I don't want to ruin the integrity of the group or the unity of the group just because I'm pissed off because I have to be there. But that's really no benefit to me. I mean, and I have...
And that's you respecting the group because the group has value for other people.
Yeah, I have huge respect for 12-step. Huge respect because I know hundreds of people whose lives have been saved by 12-step fellowships, and I would never, ever want to disrupt that. But I have a massive problem with me being mandated to go to something that I tell people, that I tell the Board of Nursing regularly, I tell the monitoring agency regularly, this is detrimental to my recovery. Why do I have to keep going to this thing? I am over 2 years into recovery. I am very stable in my recovery. Everything that I do in my life reflects my stability. Mm-hmm. I should not be mandated to go to a support group that I have never found supportive for me personally. And that's not my fault, and that's not AA's fault.
And you're not alone. Whether
Too.
People admit it or not. I mean, I would say it's probably 50-50 in my experience. Half the people I've encountered are like, yeah, I find value and I go, and the other half are like, it's ridiculous. I'm on my phone. I tune out when I'm there.
Yeah.
I put my headphones on. I mean, it's it's hit or miss, but it comes back to the same philosophy that it's not, it should be about the person, the individual, and not about the system, and especially when you don't have evidence that it works, right? Many of these programs will say, like, we have evidence that this works, that 4 meetings a week is the right number, and our people are successful. Well, are they successful because of the meetings? I'd be willing. That's up for debate.
Back to the
Some people, yes, they
what
may
does
be.
Success mean? And I mean, I think
and what is success?
For me personally, me using drugs or not using drugs has absolutely zero to do with recovery for me.
Right. Me too.
And what I mean by that, I mean, I don't mean that I'm going to go use after this, this episode, because that's not my plan. But my point is that, again, if we frame recovery around drug use, we're missing the boat. Because going back to the whole point of talking today was about recovery has to do primarily with purpose in life and overall happiness and wellness. And what can we do to foster that in an individual? And I don't think what we've historically done with drug treatment and how we talk about relapse prevention does a whole lot of good, because we're framing it around the use of a substance, not framing it around what makes you happy in your life.
That's like all our drug policy.
Yeah.
It's always about
drug policy. It's treatment. It's our entire mindset.
Yeah, our entire mindset. It's about the substance. And the thing is, it's not about the substance at all. It has nothing to do with the substance.
Right.
they're just, but everything we do, whether it's prevention, education, treatment, people that say they're harm reductionists, like, it's about the substance. It's about the substance. It's about the substance. It has nothing to do with the substance, right?
Yeah.
But it's our attitudes towards these substances, and because you're using this substance or you use that substance, that makes you this kind of human being that we don't value or don't like or criminalize, right? And that's, for lack of a better, term, it's bullshit. It's bullshit, and we got it wrong. So
I guess that's probably a good spot to start wrapping up. It's
bullshit.
Yeah,
it is bullshit, and it needs to change. And I think we're making change, but we have a long way to go. The more I do this work, the more I realize, like, every corner you turn, there are barriers and obstacles and stigma and discrimination and criminalization and judgment, and, like, it's just, we need a radical shift, and it's going to take time. So good news is we have a lot of work to do. The good news and the bad news is there's a lot of work to do, and there's a lot of great people in every facet of the areas that we've been talking about that are doing amazing work, from criminal justice to public health and harm reduction and in the medical system. There are, but it's like, our systems have been designed to do harm to people who use drugs,
Sure.
and communities where drug use is rampant. And that needs to change, but it starts with us. So, yeah.
I agree, and I thought this was a really cool. I don't know. I really did want to spend time talking about this, like, to capture this in the moment. I mean, because this is just a couple days ago that all this sort of really reached the boiling point and a decision point to leave this job and to make big adjustments in life. And I find that not many of us talk about it in the moment when we're struggling. And so I thought it was really cool to capture, because I'm sure if I were to talk to you about this in a couple weeks, I might be speaking about it differently than right now, as I'm still going through and still processing through this. I'm on the downside. I mean, since making the decision to leave and leaving my job, it was almost like I hate to use it, but yeah, the weight was lifted off my shoulders. I feel so much better without that
and
restraint.
From my perspective, you're clearly better, and you've got some doors that are opening up to you that are going to lead to new directions that are really exciting, right? So sometimes we hang on to, like, what we know and where we are because of uncertainty, but you have to let go to move on.
Yeah.
It's and you can't really keep one foot in and have one foot on dry land and get anywhere. Like, you're stuck. You're still stuck. So, but that takes, like, courage and like, you're valuing your health, right, and your recovery, which is a really good, which is actually is an amazing sign, right? Because when we are struggling or we have a substance use disorder, frequently, we have so much shame and anger that's directed inward, and we don't really care. But this, to me, shows, man, you value yourself, you value, your career, you value the idea of having meaning and purpose in your life. And if you're not getting it where you're at, and you gave it a good try, and I know you communicated that to your organization, and you're like, okay, well, it's not working out, and now I'm going to move on and move in a different direction. And that's pretty amazing and pretty exciting to me, from my perspective.
Yeah, it was different being. I didn't really see it at all. I mean, it's so much. It's so much different the perspective of, like, from you and Trish. Like, for me, it was.
Well, we're not you.
No,
We're
no,
standing outside, right?
That's true. But I don't know. I really thought it would be really cool, and I hope that this offers something to the discussion, like in the moment to talk about this. That one, we still struggle, right? That things are still going to happen in your life, and how do we move through that in a productive way and survive and
that's life and recovery.
Yeah.
Right? It's that graph, of recovery with that squiggly line
Sure.
going all over the place. Like, recovery is not a straight line. Life isn't a straight line.
Yeah.
This is normal stuff. I mean, we're having a real conversation about it, but this is life, right? And recovery.
It was just neat to take that little slice and dissect it. Of like, okay, here's this little thing, this little blip. Like, let's cut it down and see what's in there.
Was it so little?
No,
but I mean, it was little, but it had a big impact on
Sure,
you,
yeah.
right? Like, even earlier when you were saying, "Oh, that subtle shift." Well, it wasn't that subtle for you, right?
Right.
And maybe, in the organization you're in, they're like, "Oh, we're going to move Bill here. It's not going to be a big deal. He's going to be doing a lot of the same stuff. Not exactly different clients, but we'll slide him over here. It won't be a big deal." To you, that was a massive deal. That like that changed everything.
Yeah.
For you, right?
It did.
And so, at first you may have been like, "Oh, okay, this isn't going to be that bad." And within a few days, you're depressed, you're not sleeping, your wife's saying you're lashing out more. Like, yeah, like, I get it. I mean, it's, but you're a human being.
Yeah.
Right? You're human. We're all human beings. That's not like an unreasonable, like, that's a normal reaction,
Mm-hmm.
I mean, if you did nothing, that would be abnormal, and you start thinking about acting out, in very unhealthy ways, like, that would not have been healthy. This, to me, is a lot healthier,
Yeah.
So,
No, I mean, so, yeah, I mean, I guess thanks for
Good place to
listening.
stop.
Yeah, it was good.
Yeah.
And I hope this offers something to somebody. It was fun to talk about. And, we hope that if you're listening to this and you're struggling or you're going through the same thing or trying to figure out for yourself what the hell does a relapse prevention plan look like, we're with you. We're trying to figure that out ourselves too, and hopefully this offered something of value to you that might prevent you from going down a road that you don't want to go down.
Great spot to stop.
All right, see you next time.
Thank you for listening to Health Professionals in Recovery. Please visit our website at www.healthprosinrecovery.com and subscribe to our podcast on iTunes. You can also follow us on Twitter at HPIR Podcast. If you are struggling with substance use disorder and need help, please call the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration at 1-800-662-4357. Take it from us, people can and do recover.